together. And the best to see the stratas above us here, but on top of this little knoll is standing out. We can see the sandstone strata. We come down and we see this kind of pinkish strata, and then we see little different composition. Looks like a quartzite. It's fused sand grains versus non-fused sand grains in sandstone. So is that an interesting boundary?
Yeah, it is.
Really is. And so we like to look at boundaries between strata. And boy, is this an interesting one, because what do we see at the base of the sandstone right here above us? We see giant quartzite boulders in fine matrix.
Oh, yeah.
You see that? And we see cobble size. We see boulders. Those are those are volleyball and bigger. Okay, cobbles are like softballs. And then we see pebbles in here that are gummy berries, that kind of thing. Okay. And then there's a sand matrix.
Is it an ancient riverbed?
Okay. All right. So we got to talk about what we see, and then we can talk about the interpretation later, right? We talk. That's the important thing. Is we're here to explore, discover, wonder, interpret, and worship, right? So this is got a lot of quartzite boulders in that coarse matrix. And that's what really fascinates me about this outcrop. And then seeing the boundary with what's underneath it. And the boundary is not conforming to the underlying strata, the overlying strata. They kind of swale in and out of it. And this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Really interesting. What do you think about the quartzite? It's kind of like what we saw at Van Hise Rock, isn't it?
Yep.
Now at Van Hise Rock, it may have been tipped vertical. Out here, it may be more horizontal. It probably is not exactly horizontal, and I see some evidence of that. But it's a boundary, and it's an erosional boundary. You know what I'm talking about? The quartzite boulders above seem to have come from this quartzite underneath. You see that? So the quartzite was here when this surface was beveled, eroded, and then the boulders redeposited that were plucked loose. Are you following where I'm going with this? Okay. So that's a pronounced boundary between metamorphic and sedimentary rocks, between fine sand and coarse boulders. There's a lot of contrast there. We have a name for this, and it's called unconformity. Unconformity, right? The strata are not conformable on going up the sequence. Okay. When I see big boulders in sandy beds, what's the biggest boulder we're seeing here? 4 feet diameter, bigger? You see anything bigger than that? We're seeing some big boulders, and when I see boulders and fine sand, that warms my heart. Okay. It causes joy in my spirit. Okay, is that the way to say it? Okay, because that is pretty powerful, what's going on up there, right? Have you ever tried to move a 4-foot diameter boulder?
Yes.
Not easy, right? They weigh a ton or two. Okay, those kind of boulders.
Literally.
And these boulders we're going to find in Parfrey's Glen tomorrow on our hike. As we walk up the creek at Parfrey's Glen, we'll see boulders in the sandstone above. This is our first look at the top of the Baraboo quartzite in the beginning of the Cambrian sock sandstone here. yeah, it warms my heart. Okay, why? Because I'm looking for powerful agents, and when I see boulders 4 feet in diameter, that's wonderful. By the way, my email address is mudflowman@comcast.net. Okay, Mudflowman, when he gets near something like this, there's a twitching in the left thigh bone. Okay, and then joy floods my spirit. Okay, and this is cool, really cool up there. If it could talk, what would it tell? What kind of story would it tell? Okay, we'll talk about the interpretation here in a little bit. And but the boundary is obviously an unconformity. Are you with me on what an unconformity is?
Yep.
Okay, there's enough description of rocks in southern Wisconsin to know that the Cambrian rocks in southern Wisconsin are underlain by the Precambrian metamorphic and igneous rocks. And so we're looking for an erosion surface under that. And what did we find right here? We found it. Okay, so this is really cool. Okay, it's an erosion surface within the rock record, and that's called an unconformity. And because of the extent of the unconformity in southern Wisconsin, it's called the basal unconformity of the Sauk sequence. That's if I was talking to a geologist, I'd say that. Okay, we're seeing the basal strata of the Sauk sequence with an unconformity underneath it. And that causes warmth to my heart because this unconformity goes down into Illinois and Missouri, Lamont, Regan, sandstone, other things outside the Sauk area here in Sauk County, Wisconsin. And as you go down there, you'll discover that those have a similar thing. They have an unconformity underneath. And so it's a widespread unconformity here in Wisconsin, down there in Illinois, and then over there in Missouri. And then you go into Iowa, down toward Oklahoma. It's buried, but it comes back up to the surface right near Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Oh, really?
It comes up to the surface, and in Manitou Springs, Colorado, on Fountain Creek, I've seen this almost identical thing. It's there, it's boulders, big boulders, granite boulders sitting with unconformity on granite rock. Here it's quartzite rock. So whatever the rock type underneath, it's kind of constant to see that surface, the erosion surface, and then that rock. What do we call that rock? There's a name for it in Geology 101 classes. Maybe you've heard of it. Conglomerate. Conglomerate. Okay, when it's rounded pebbles in class, it's called a conglomerate. When you have boulders in it, it's called a boulder conglomerate. And if it's angular, if the blocks are really angular, you could call it a breccia conglomerate. Okay, breccia is broken, shattered rock fragments. These have some degree of rounding, it looks like. You see some rounding to them. Okay, but they're not perfectly rounded. They didn't sit on a beach and erode for 1 million years or something like that. It's very interesting, their composition. Okay, that strata comes up in Manitou Springs, Colorado. On top of the sandstone in Manitou, Colorado, sits a shale layer and then a limestone above. Do you know of any shale and limestone here in Wisconsin above the sandstone? Yeah, So it's the same sequence. And over in Grand Canyon, we see the sequence: Tapeats sandstone, Bright Angel shale, Muav limestone. Have you ever seen that that sequence in the strata diagrams of Grand Canyon? So we have a miniature Grand Canyon sequence right up there, coming down to this surface, and underneath we have quartzite. Is that cool? Okay. How easy is it to see the great unconformity in Grand Canyon? You've got to take a 7-day raft trip minimum, okay, or hike a mile below the rim of the canyon vertically on a 10-mile trail to get down to the great unconformity.
Which trail?
So this was a lot
Easier
hike, yes. Okay, so we have this pan-continental sandstone layer with a pan-continental shale layer and a limestone layer above it that's sitting on an unconformity surface that's sitting on quartzite here.
Can you give me like the most layman, what exactly does unconformity mean when you say it's sitting on an unconformity layer?
Right, an unconformity is not a thing, it's a surface.
Okay.
It's a two-dimensional thing. The sandstone is three-dimensional volume, right?
Okay.
So I imagine this surface in here, and that surface is called unconformity.
Okay.
Is that a good way to
Yeah.
say it?
Okay.
Okay, did I connect with you?
Yeah. You got to remember, I teach youth, so I'm trying to figure out like.
Yeah, surface.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
think
is
of
an
it.
unconformity something that's not supposed to be there?
No, I get that.
Well,
Like the gym?
it could be, there could be unconformity anywhere, but when you are looking and you're exploring the landscape and you discover one of these things, you take note. Okay, so it's
Because it's not normal,
not abundant.
Well, it wouldn't be there at all if the rock had just continuously been deposited and continued on up the stratigraphic column. That was a place where there was a cessation of activity.
Yeah.
And then after a period, the next rock was put on that surface.
Okay, now you're going the next place I want to go. Okay, so I see process of sedimentation here, right, in the strata, above and below the unconformity. What do I infer from the unconformity? Stopping of sedimentation and some other process taking over. What would that be?
Ancient river.
Tectonics and erosion. Okay, the two possible products. And so the tectonics and erosion are evidence along the unconformity, and then it goes back to sedimentation again. You see what I'm doing? Sedimentation, unconformity, which represents tectonics, erosion, then back to sedimentation again. So the process changes at the boundary.
What is the supposed time difference?
Okay, well, nobody knows. There's no.
What is this?
There's no
secular
tags on the rock.
No, what do the secular scientists say?
Okay, well, here's what we do. Let's keep going to interpret, and then we'll find out what the evolutionists and creationists have said about these things. How's that sound? Does it sound good? So you always want to keep observation and interpretation separate. Why? Because you don't want the agenda to skew your understanding of the subject and especially your interpretation of data. Okay. So am I connecting? Are you kind of understanding where I'm going? Yes.
Unconformity, would that be like a dam breaking and then the water just taking everything with it?
Okay. So it changes, the process changes from sedimentation to erosion or tectonics or something, yeah, okay. If there was a volcano sitting there, you might imagine volcanism, process of sedimentation, quitting. Okay, so, but there's a break. That's the take-home interpretation. Now, and we have the blanket sandstone conglomerate on top, don't we? And that's the real mind blower, okay? And then we have the quartzite underneath. The quartzite represents pretty finely sorted sand, right? Finely sorted sand that's been fused together to form a quartzite kind of rock. So, and then all of a sudden you come to the textural break, enormous texture change here, and the boundary. Okay, a man named Robert Dott, who I referred to before, was very instrumental in understanding and interpreting the sandstone up here. He said, look at this unconformity, and he imagined a transgressing ocean over the North American continent. You seeing where I'm going with it, or where he wanted to go? He imagined an advancing beach that advanced across the whole continent from down south, coming up here onto the Canadian Shield. Okay? And that's what he thought formed the sandstone. Then he looked at the sand and the coarse boulders, and you know what he said? I expect to see a beach here where the ocean advanced over the continent, but what do I see? I see some really powerful things. And so geologists generally are thinking very critically about the idea of advancing beach, and they're imagining advancing storm waves or crashing floods against the shore of the ocean. Yeah, you see where I'm going with it? Okay, it's not a channel deposit like a river; it's a planar deposit like the bottom of an ocean or something like that. And so Don imagined a catastrophically modified shoreline. And when we go to Parfreeze Glen tomorrow, we'll find more evidence of that. But here's the first look at what the sedimentation is like. Mudflow Man likes big boulders, and here's what Mudflow Man imagines. Imagine a slurry of boulders moving at maybe 5 meters per second. Okay, it's 50% sand and boulders and 50% water. A slurry, a gravity slurry of something like that, flowing along the bottom of a very catastrophic advancing ocean. A flood on the earth. That's the kind of thing we see here. So we can describe the physical forces that move the boulders. You can use vector physics to describe the boulders, and the Blandin sluggard boulder doesn't move unless you kick it, and you really need to give it a kick. And so if you have a slurry of boulders, that's a good way to move boulders around long distance. We don't know how far these move from but there's lots of quartzite underneath the sandstone. Okay, so the two interpretations, the evolutionary interpretations of beach, this is a beach deposit. Okay, you seen a beach like that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a kind of a stretch, but I guess you know there might have been some really powerful storms back then. You know, maybe they did things like this, or a big flood, and of course slurry boulders moving around and that kind of thing.
Then
Okay.
are these huge